This is HOA common property now, Major, Karen Covington sneered, her voice a grating mix of smug satisfaction and cheap perfume that couldn't quite cover the scent of stale cigarettes. She gestured with a dismissive flick of her wrist toward the churning maw of a concrete truck, its chute aimed directly at the base of my custom-built wrought iron gate. Your little private entrance is an unauthorized encroachment. We're rectifying the situation permanently. Her floral muumuu billowed in the morning breeze, a vibrant, garish flag planted firmly on sovereign land that wasn't hers. The concrete, thick and gray like liquid death, began to pour, a viscous tide swallowing the hinges and locking mechanism I'd spent a month fabricating by hand. It was a beautiful piece of work, a testament to patience and skill, and she was bearing it alive, entombing my access to the back 40 acres of my own property under a tombstone of petty tyranny and Portland cement. I watched the thick sludge ooze and spread, a slow-motion violation that felt like a physical blow. Every dollar of the $5,000 it cost me to build it, plus the $10,000 in property value it represented, dissolving into a hardening block of spite. This wasn't just about a gate, it was a declaration of war, and her smug, fleshy face, radiating the triumphant glow of a petty despot who just crushed a minor rebellion, was a sight I would burn into my memory for the long fight ahead. She had no idea who she was dealing with. If you've ever felt the suffocating grip of an HOA run by a power-mad tyrant, smash that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Tell me your own HOA nightmare, because we're about to walk through how a retired Army Corps of Engineers officer dismantled a corrupt board, piece by bureaucratic piece, using their own rulebook as a sledgehammer. The story starts here, with the wet, sloppy sound of my property rights being buried alive. My name is Jack Morgan, and for 25 years I served in the Army Corps of Engineers. I built bridges under fire in places most people can't pronounce, and designed infrastructure to withstand forces of nature you only see on the news. I understand rules, I understand regulations, and most importantly, I understand property lines down to the millimeter. When I retired, all I wanted was peace, quiet, and a piece of land to call my own, a place where the only orders I had to follow were the ones my wife, Sarah, gave me about taking out the trash. We found that place in Maple Creek Estates, or so we thought. It was a beautiful plot on the edge of the development, 10 acres of manicured lawn and gardens near the house, and another 40 acres of rolling hills and woodlands stretching out behind it, my own private sanctuary. The key to that sanctuary was the service gate at the back of the property, which opened onto an old dirt track that locals sometimes use to access a nearby state park trail. The property survey was crystal clear. The entire 40 acres, including the dirt track up to the fence line of the next property, was mine. The plat map filed with the county showed an easement, a standard 15-foot utility corridor that ran along the track, but the land itself was deeded to my lot. For the first year, things were perfect. I graded the track, laid down fresh gravel, and maintained the gate, making my little corner of the world better than I found it, just as I'd been trained to do. I didn't mind neighbors using the track to get to the park. I believed in being a good neighbor. That all changed the day Karen Covington was elected HOA president. She was a plus-size woman in her late 50s who moved with the gravitational certainty of a minor planet. A woman who saw the three-ring binder of HOA covenants not as a guide for community living, but as a holy text from which she derived her divine right to rule. Our first interaction was a notice of violation, a crisp white envelope in my mailbox. The offense? The color of my mailbox flag was non-compliant red. The approved shade, according to Section 4, Paragraph C, Subsection 2 of the Architectural Guidelines, was heritage red. I painted the flag. The next violation was for my garden hose being visible from the street for more than 2 hours after use. Then another for a small American flag decal on my truck window, deemed an unapproved vehicle modification. Each notice was a paper cut, a small annoyance designed to establish dominance. I complied with a quiet, simmering patience, documenting everything. I saw her for what she was, a bully who'd been handed a sliver of authority and was determined to stretch it into an empire. The gate was her ultimate target. It represented something she couldn't stand: my independence. It was my private access to my land, a part of my world she couldn't control from the sidewalk. She started by claiming the dirt track was a community bridle path on HOA common land. I politely sent her a copy of my property survey and the county plat map, highlighting the easement and my property lines. I explained that while I graciously allowed neighbors to use it, it was unequivocally my land. Her response was to escalate. The letters started arriving weekly, then daily, each one more demanding than the last, citing fabricated rules and non-existent bylaws. She claimed the gate was an unauthorized structure, built on common property. She demanded I remove it or the HOA would do it for me and bill me for the cost. I responded through certified mail with a letter from a real estate attorney, simply reaffirming the legal facts of the survey and warning them against trespassing. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought legal reality would be a bucket of cold water on her power trip. Instead, she brought a concrete truck. The immediate aftermath of the concrete pour was a study in contrasts. On one side, you had Karen Covington, puffed up like a triumphant toad, hands on her hips, directing the truck driver as if she were orchestrating a military maneuver. Her two loyal board members, a mousy woman named Brenda and a retired accountant named Gerald, who always looked vaguely confused, stood behind her, nodding like bobbleheads in a hurricane. On the other side, there was me. My pulse was a steady, rhythmic drum, a familiar cadence from years spent in high-stakes situations. Outwardly, I was stone. Inwardly, a cold, methodical fire had been lit. Anger was a fuel, and I knew how to burn it efficiently. The first thing I did was pull out my phone and start recording. I didn't shout, I didn't threaten, I simply documented. I walked a slow, deliberate perimeter, capturing the concrete truck's license plate, the logo of the company on its door, the faces of Karen, Brenda, and Gerald, and the slow, inexorable flow of wet cement engulfing my gate. "Karen," I said, my voice perfectly level, the phone's camera aimed directly at her face. "For the record, could you please state your name and your official capacity for authorizing the destruction of private property on my land?" Her smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The presence of a camera recording her changed the dynamic from a neighborhood dispute to the creation of evidence. "I am Karen Covington, president of the Maple Creek Homeowners Association," she declared, recovering her bluster. "And this is not your land. This is a community asset. We are reclaiming it." "And the legal basis for that claim?" I asked, panning the camera to the wet concrete, now a solid foot deep. "The covenants," she snapped. "You should have read them before you moved in, Major." She used my old rank like an insult, a way to diminish my standing. It was a foolish mistake. It only served to remind me of the code I live by, a code of discipline and overwhelming force in response to aggression. I stopped recording, saved the file, and immediately uploaded it to a secure cloud server. Step 1. Secure the evidence. Next, I called the sheriff's department. When the deputy arrived, a young guy named Miller who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, the concrete was already beginning to set. The truck was gone. Karen and her cronies had retreated, their mission of vandalism complete. I explained the situation calmly, presenting Deputy Miller with my property survey, the county plat map, and the deed to my house. I showed him the clear, undeniable lines that proved the gate and the surrounding land were mine. He looked at the documents, then at the hardening gray slab, and sighed. "Sir, I see what you're showing me, and I hear you," he said, his tone apologetic. "But she's claiming this is an HOA dispute over common area. Without a court order clarifying that property line for me, my hands are tied. This is a civil matter." I knew he was going to say that. It's the standard playbook. Law enforcement avoids getting caught in the crossfire of civil disputes. "So, Deputy," I clarified, my voice still calm, "if I were to go to her house and pour concrete on her front door, citing a rule I just made up, that would also be a civil matter?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I'm not saying it's right. I'm just telling you what I can and can't do. You need to take this to a judge." He took my statement, filed a report for destruction of property, but listed it as a civil dispute, giving me a case number that was effectively useless for criminal proceedings, but would be pure gold for the lawsuit to come. Step 2. Establish a paper trail with law enforcement even if they can't act. The moment his cruiser pulled away, I made another call. This one was to David Chen, a man I'd served with years ago. He'd been a sharp-witted JAG officer who could dismantle a flawed argument with surgical precision. Now he was a partner at one of the top real estate law firms in the state. "Jack, you old dog," his voice crackled over the phone. "Don't tell me you finally decided to retire from retirement and invade a small country." "Something like that, Dave," I said. "Only the country is my backyard, and the invading army is a 50-something woman in a muumuu." I explained the situation, from the mailbox flag to the concrete tomb where my gate used to be. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. There was a long pause. "Jack," he finally said, his voice losing its jovial tone and taking on the sharp edge I remembered from our time in service. "She did what?" "She brought a concrete truck onto your deeded property and destroyed your gate based on her interpretation of the covenants?" "That's the long and short of it," I confirmed. "Email me everything you have. The video, the police report number, your deed, the survey, the plat map, every violation notice she's ever sent you, and a copy of the HOA covenants and bylaws. Everything. We're not just going to get your gate fixed, Jack. We're going to dismantle her little kingdom." The rest of that day was spent at my dining room table, which Sarah and I converted into a war room. Documents were spread out like battle plans. I scanned every page, organized them into digital folders, and wrote a detailed chronological narrative of Karen's escalating harassment. It was a familiar process. Gather intelligence, define the objective, and prepare the operational plan. The objective was no longer just about a gate. It was about justice. Get when you're about to take something. Get when you're about to take something apart, piece by piece, just to see how it works before you break it. I looked up from the mountain of paper at my wife of 30 years. "She picked the wrong fight, Sarah," I said. "She thinks this is about a gate. She has no idea what it's really about. It was about the fundamental principle that a person's home, their land, is their own. And I would defend mine with the same methodical resolve I had defended my country." The war had begun. The first salvo was fired from David's office 2 days later. It was a formal, brutally direct demand letter sent via courier to Karen Covington, with copies sent to every member of the HOA board. The letter was a masterpiece of legal clarity, stripping away all of Karen's bluster and leaving only the cold, hard facts. It cited the county records, the property deed, and the official survey, unequivocally establishing my ownership of the land in question. It detailed the easement as being for utility access only, with no provision for community recreational use or HOA control. It then described her actions, leading a vendor onto private property and directing the destruction of a permanent fixture, as illegal trespass and criminal damage to property. The demand was simple and non-negotiable. The HOA was to immediately hire a licensed and bonded contractor to remove the concrete slab and all associated debris, restoring the land to its original condition. They were to pay for the replacement of my custom gate, valued at $5,000. They were to pay for a new land survey to officially mark the property lines to prevent any future confusion, and they were to pay my preliminary legal fees. The total came to just over $10,000. Finally, it included a formal cease and desist order, warning Karen and the board against any further contact, harassment, or trespass. We gave them 10 business days to respond with their full compliance. It was a reasonable, fact-based demand designed to give them a clear and easy off-ramp. A sane and rational board would have immediately contacted their lawyer, realized the monumental screw-up, and cut a check. But I was dealing with Karen Covington. Sanity and reason were not in her toolbox. Her response arrived a week later, not from a lawyer, but directly from her. It was a single sheet of paper, printed on the official HOA letterhead, reeking of arrogance. "Mr. Morgan," it began, foregoing any professional salutation, "the board has received your interesting letter. We reject your demands in their entirety. The area in question is, and has always been, considered a community bridle path under the purview of the association. Your unapproved gate was an eyesore and a liability, and the board acted within its authority as granted by the covenants, conditions, and restrictions to rectify the violation." But she didn't stop there. Attached to the letter was an official HOA invoice. They were billing me. The invoice listed several charges. Unauthorized structure removal fee, $2,500, presumably for the concrete. Common area restoration fee, $1,500, and a new freshly invented fine for willful disregard of board directives, $1,000. The total was $5,000, due in 30 days. At the bottom in bold underlined text was a threat. Failure to remit payment will result in the placement of a lien on your property, followed by foreclosure proceedings as allowed by the state of Texas and our governing documents. David's reaction when I read it to him over the phone was a low whistle. "Wow," he said, a note of genuine admiration in his voice. "She's not just doubling down, she's pushing all her chips into the middle on a pair of twos. This is beautiful, Jack. This is gift-wrapped arrogance. We couldn't have hoped for a better response." He explained that her letter, written without legal counsel, was a treasure trove of actionable admissions. By stating the board acted within its authority, she was officially claiming responsibility. By invoicing me for the very act of vandalism, she was creating a paper trail of their malicious intent. The foreclosure threat was the cherry on top, an attempt at illegal coercion. "So what's our next move?" one I asked, looking out my window at the ugly gray scar on my property line. "We let her walk deeper into the wood," David said. "She's given us the rope. Now we let her fashion the noose. Don't respond to the letter. Don't pay the invoice. We're going to go quiet. In the meantime, you and I are going to build a fortress of facts so impenetrable that by the time we're done, her little HOA will be nothing but a smoking crater." My mission was clear. David would handle the legal strategy. I would be his man on the ground, his intelligence officer. My first task was to get a deeper understanding of the battlefield. I wasn't just fighting Karen. I was fighting the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the document she wielded like a scepter. I spent the next 2 days reading that 90-page binder from cover to cover 3 times. I highlighted, I took notes, I cross-referenced sections. What I found was a document full of vague, poorly defined terms, a paradise for a bully looking for loopholes. Phrases like aesthetically pleasing, harmonious community standards, and actions detrimental to the neighborhood were scattered throughout. They were subjective, unenforceable terms that Karen had weaponized, appointing herself the sole arbiter of what was harmonious or aesthetically pleasing. But I also found the HOA's weaknesses. I found the section on the board's fiduciary duty, their legal obligation to act in the best financial interest of the community. I found the procedures for calling special meetings and for recalling board members. And most importantly, I found the section that described the HOA's jurisdiction. It explicitly stated that the association's authority extended only to the common areas as defined in the official plat map filed with Travis County. It was the smoking gun. The plat map was my sacred text, the one document that superseded their entire binder of flimsy rules. Karen had based her entire crusade on a lie, the lie that the path was a common area, and she had just put that lie in writing in an official response to my lawyer. While I was dissecting their rule book, I started my own quiet campaign of information gathering. I began taking walks around the neighborhood in the early evenings, always with my friendly golden retriever, Duke, by my side. People will talk to a man with a dog. I started with simple, friendly greetings, reintroducing myself to neighbors I'd only ever waved at. I didn't lead with my grievance. I listened. And what I heard was a litany of petty abuses, a pattern of harassment that had been going on for years. The stories tumbled out, one after another, a quiet chorus of resentment that had been simmering just beneath the surface of Maple Creek's manicured lawns. There was old Mrs. Gable, a widow in her 80s who lived on a fixed income. Karen had waged a 6-month war against her over a collection of garden gnomes her late husband had given her. They were deemed tacky lawn ornaments and a violation of the aesthetic code. Mrs. Gable received weekly fines of $50 until she finally, tearfully, packed the gnomes away in her garage. The HOA had placed a lien on her house for the unpaid fines, which now totaled over $1,000 with late fees and administrative charges. She was terrified of losing the home she'd lived in for 40 years. Then I met the Rodriguez family, a young couple with 2 kids. Their crime was a portable basketball hoop. Their 10-year-old son Leo loved to play. The hoop was always stored neatly in their garage at night, but during the day it would be at the edge of their driveway. Karen deemed it a temporary structure that was not in harmony with the neighborhood's character. The family was fined $200. When Mr. Rodriguez tried to appeal at an HOA meeting, Karen cut him off, ruled him out of order, and had the fine doubled for insubordination. They paid it, not wanting to cause more trouble, but the joy had been sucked out of their son's afternoon games. The list went on. A family was cited for having a commercial vehicle, their personal contracting van, parked in their driveway for 15 minutes while they unloaded tools. Another was forced to remove a small, tasteful welcome sign from their porch because it wasn't on the pre-approved list of 4 acceptable porch signs. Each story was a small injustice on its own, a death by 1,000 paper cuts. But taken together, they painted a portrait of a community living under the thumb of a petty tyrant. Karen wasn't enforcing rules for the betterment of the neighborhood. She was using them as a weapon to bully and control her neighbors, feeding her own ego with every violation notice she sent. I documented every story, asking for permission to record their accounts. I collected copies of their violation notices, their fines, their frustrated emails to the board that went unanswered. I was no longer just fighting for my gate. I was fighting for Mrs. Gable's gnomes and Leo Rodriguez's basketball hoop. I was building a class action case without even realizing it. My most important discovery, however, came from a man named George, a retired surveyor who had lived in Maple Creek since it was first developed 30 years ago. I found him tending his prize-winning roses one afternoon. "You're the fellow with the concrete gate, aren't you?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with a bit of mischief. I admitted I was. "Knew it," he grunted, snipping a dead bloom. "Karen's been itching to get her hands on that access track for years. Thinks it makes the neighborhood look more exclusive if we have a private bridle path." He then dropped the bombshell. "Thing is, that easement isn't for the HOA at all. Never was." He explained that the original developer had granted the 15-foot easement to the county water authority to access a pumping station deep in the woods, miles behind my property. The recreational use by neighbors was just an informal tradition that started because the previous owner of my property was a friendly guy who didn't mind. The HOA had absolutely zero legal standing over that strip of land. It was a utility easement, plain and simple, and my deed was ironclad. "She knows it too," George added, wiping his hands on a rag. "I told her myself at a board meeting 5 years ago when she first brought it up. I showed her the original plat filings. She just shouted me down, said I didn't know what I was talking about." This was the key. This wasn't just a mistake or a misinterpretation of the documents. This was a deliberate knowing act of fraud and trespass. Karen had been told the truth years ago by a professional surveyor and had chosen to ignore it because it didn't fit her agenda. She had knowingly lied to the board and the community, and she had just put that lie in writing in her response to my lawyer. My fortress of facts was now complete. It was built on a foundation of county records, fortified with the personal testimonies of a dozen wrong neighbors, and crowned with the damning evidence of Karen's own premeditated deception. While I was gathering my intelligence, the 30-day deadline on Karen's invoice to me came and went. As expected, on day 31, a certified letter arrived. It was a notice of lien, formally notifying me that the Maple Creek Homeowners Association had placed a $5,000 lien on my property for unpaid fees and fines. It was a bold, aggressive move, and it was exactly what David had predicted. She was playing checkers, moving her pieces one predictable square at a time. We were playing chess, and we were about to put her queen in check. "She did it," I told David over the phone, the notice in my hand. "She actually filed the lien." "Oh, this is Christmas in July," David said, his voice alight with glee. "By filing a fraudulent lien, she's just committed a felony in this state. This moves beyond simple civil damages. We can now sue her and the board members personally for slander of title and for violating the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. Their liability just exploded." He instructed me to do nothing. Don't contest the lien through the HOA's kangaroo court. Let it stand on the record as another piece of evidence. Our countermove wouldn't be a defense, it would be a full-scale assault. The plan was now set. David began drafting the lawsuit, a multi-count complaint that would be a legal battering ram. It would include trespass, destruction of property, a request for declaratory judgment to affirm my property rights, and now claims for fraudulent, lien, and slander of title. It would name the HOA as a defendant, but it would also name Karen Covington, Brenda, and Gerald as individual defendants, piercing the corporate veil of the HOA to hold them personally liable for acting with gross negligence and willful misconduct. While David prepared the legal artillery, my job was to prepare the social and political battlefield. The annual HOA meeting was in 6 weeks. It was typically a sleepy affair, with only a handful of residents attending. This year it was going to be different. This year it was going to be a referendum on Karen Covington's reign of terror. The plan for the annual meeting was simple: turn Karen's stage into her own public trial. For weeks I worked quietly behind the scenes. I created a simple one-page fact sheet. At the top was a crystal-clear image copied from the county plat map, showing my property lines and the utility easement. Below it, I put bullet points summarizing the facts: my ownership, the purpose of the easement, and the HOA's lack of jurisdiction. I then listed a brief, anonymized summary of the other grievances I had collected: the gnome fines, the basketball hoop penalties, the harassment of other residents. I didn't add any inflammatory language. The facts themselves were damning enough. Working with the Rodriguezes and a few other motivated neighbors, we formed a small, clandestine committee. We divided up the neighborhood map, and in the week leading up to the meeting, we went door to door. We didn't campaign or make speeches. On legal actions, and we think you should on legal actions, and we think you should know the facts behind them. The response was a slow-burning fire. People were shocked. They had believed Karen's narrative because it was easier than questioning it. They'd paid their petty fines because it was easier than fighting. But seeing the hard evidence on paper, coupled with the realization that their neighbors were suffering too, changed everything. The whispers started. The phone calls between neighbors began. For the first time, the residents of Maple Creek were talking to each other, not just about the weather, but about the systemic abuse happening right under their noses. The night of the meeting, the community center meeting room, which usually held maybe 15 people, was packed. Over 100 residents were crammed into the space. Extra chairs had to be brought in from a storage closet. The air was thick with anticipation. Karen, Brenda, and Gerald sat at a folding table at the front of the room, looking completely bewildered by the turnout. Karen, dressed in a particularly loud purple pantsuit, gripped her gavel like a weapon. She clearly thought this massive crowd was a sign of her popularity, a testament to her strong leadership. She beamed, a monarch surveying her loyal subjects. The meeting started with the usual drab recitation of last year's minutes in the treasurer's report, read by a flustered Gerald. He droned on about landscaping costs and pool chemicals, but no one was listening. The tension in the room was a palpable thing. Then Karen opened the floor for new business. As many of you know, she began, her voice dripping with self-importance, the board has been forced to take decisive action this year to protect our community assets and uphold our aesthetic standards. This has required us to retain legal counsel to deal with a particularly stubborn resident. She didn't use my name, but every eye in the room flickered toward me, where I sat in the front row. These legal battles are expensive, and therefore the board is proposing a one-time special assessment of $200 per household to fund our legal defense fund and ensure our covenants are respected. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. $200? To fund her personal vendetta against me? This was the moment we had been waiting for. Before anyone else could speak, I stood up. I was holding a small stack of papers. Karen, I said, my voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the silent room. Before the community votes on handing you more of their hard-earned money, I believe they have a right to see exactly what they are paying for. I walked to the front of the room and handed a copy of my packet to Karen and each board member. The packet contained my property deed, the county plat map, and the letter from George, the retired surveyor, attesting that he had informed the board of the true nature of the easement 5 years prior. This is a copy of my deed, I announced to the room, holding up a page for all to see. And this is the official county plat map. As you can all see, the land where my gate was located is, and always has been, my private property. The HOA has zero jurisdiction. This isn't a matter of opinion, it's a matter of public record. I then turned to Gerald, the treasurer. Gerald, as the treasurer, you have a fiduciary duty to the members of this association. Were you aware when you authorized payment for the concrete that you were paying for a contractor to trespass and destroy the private property of a member? Gerald's face went pale. He stammered, looking helplessly at Karen. Well, Karen said it was common area. And did you perform your own due diligence? I pressed. Did you ever look at the plat map yourself before authorizing the expenditure of thousands of dollars of our money? He shook his head, looking down at the table. Then Mrs. Gable stood up from the back of the room, her voice trembling but firm. And what about the lien you put on my house for my husband's gnomes? Is that a good use of our money? Harassing an old woman? Then Mr. Rodriguez stood up. And what about the fines for my son's basketball hoop? Is that protecting property values? Or is it just bullying? Suddenly, the room erupted. One by one, the people I had spoken to stood up and voiced their grievances. The carefully constructed facade of Karen's authority crumbled in a matter of minutes. She banged her gavel, her face turning a blotchy red. Order! You are all out of order! She shrieked. But no one was listening to her anymore. They were listening to each other. The meeting descended into chaos, but it was a righteous, cathartic chaos. It was the sound of a community finding its voice. In the midst of the uproar, I made my final move. I am formally making a motion, I shouted over the din, to recall the entire board of directors, Karen Covington, Brenda Miller, and Gerald Finney, for gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and willful misconduct. And I second the motion. The room fell silent for a beat, then exploded into applause. The vote was a landslide. By a margin of 97-3, the community voted to remove them from power. Karen sat there stunned into silence, her gavel lying useless on the table. Her reign was over. She had been publicly stripped of her power, humiliated in front of the very people she sought to control. It was a sweet, satisfying victory, but it was only the beginning. The public shaming was the social consequence. The legal and financial reckoning was still to come. The day after the disastrous HOA meeting, the dominoes began to fall, and they fell fast. The newly elected interim board, led by a level-headed retired accountant named Arthur, who I'd spoken with, immediately suspended all pending fines and violations issued by Karen's regime. Their first official act was to hire an independent auditor to go through the HOA's financials from the past 5 years. They also contacted the HOA's insurance provider and legal counsel, forwarding them my entire packet of documents. The reaction from the professionals was swift and brutal. The HOA's longtime lawyer, upon reviewing the plat maps and realizing the liability Karen had exposed them to, promptly fired the HOA as a client, stating in his letter that he could not represent a board that acted with such reckless disregard for the law and basic due diligence. This left them legally defenseless. Simultaneously, the insurance company sent a formal letter stating that they were investigating the claim related to the gate incident, but that their preliminary finding was that the board's actions likely constituted willful and malicious acts, which were explicitly excluded from their liability coverage. In short, the insurance wouldn't pay for the damages. The cost of Karen's vendetta was going to land directly on the HOA, and potentially on Karen and her cronies personally. This was the moment David had been waiting for. With the HOA in disarray and their legal and financial shield shattered, he filed our lawsuit. It was a 30-page document, a legal sledgehammer meticulously crafted to cause maximum impact. It laid out the entire history of harassment, the destruction of the gate, the filing of the fraudulent lien, and the pattern of abuse against other residents. It included affidavits from Mrs. Gable, the Rodriguez family, and George, the retired surveyor. It was an airtight case, backed by irrefutable public records and multiple sworn testimonies. The lawsuit demanded actual damages for the removal of the concrete, the replacement of the gate, legal fees, and the cost of filing a quiet title action to get a formal court order affirming my property rights once and for all. But it didn't stop there. It also demanded punitive damages. This is where the numbers got big. We sued for punitive damages based on the board's willful misconduct, their fraudulent lien, and the emotional distress caused by their campaign of harassment. David's legal strategy was brilliant. By including the other residents' stories as evidence of a pattern of abuse, he transformed my personal grievance into a case about the systemic corruption of the entire board. He argued that this wasn't just a mistake, it was a malicious abuse of power that needed to be punished to deter future boards from similar actions. The total sum of the lawsuit, combining actual and punitive damages, came to $600,000. We chose a number that was high enough to be terrifying, but still defensible in court given the egregious nature of their actions. The real purpose of the number was to force a settlement and ensure that the individuals responsible were held financially accountable. The best part was the service of the lawsuit. David arranged for a professional process server, but he gave him specific instructions. We knew Karen was volunteering at the annual Maple Creek Bake Sale, a community event she traditionally lorded over. The process server, a big, imposing man who looked like a former linebacker, walked right up to her table as she was arranging cookies. In front of dozens of neighbors, he placed the thick stack of legal documents right next to a platter of lemon squares. "Karen Covington," he boomed, his voice silencing all nearby chatter. "You've been served." He then turned to Brenda and Gerald, who were standing nearby, and handed them their copies as well. "Brenda Miller, Gerald Finney, you've been served." The scene was cinematic. Karen's face, which had been wreathed in a phony smile for the bake sale crowd, froze. The color drained from it, leaving a pasty, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. She stared at the cover page of the lawsuit, her eyes fixated on the caption. Jack Morgan versus Maple Creek HOA. Karen Covington, Brenda Miller, and Gerald Finney. Then her eyes scanned down to the prayer for relief, the section that listed the damages. I watched from a distance as her finger traced the number, $600,000. Her hand began to tremble. The cookie tongs she was holding clattered onto the table. This was the moment of impact, the point where her fantasy world of absolute power collided with the cold, hard reality of legal and financial consequences. The smugness, the arrogance, the unshakable self-righteousness, it all evaporated in an instant, replaced by the raw, primal fear of a person who has just realized they have made a catastrophic, life-altering mistake. She understood in that single horrifying moment that this wasn't a game anymore. She wasn't just going to lose her position as HOA president, she was going to lose everything. The whispers from the crowd started immediately. The public humiliation at the HOA meeting was nothing compared to this. Being served with a massive lawsuit in the middle of a community event was a new, deeper level of shame. Her downfall was no longer a neighborhood rumor. It was a public spectacle. Gerald, the former treasurer, looked like he was going to be physically ill. Brenda burst into tears, but Karen just stood there frozen, staring at the papers as if they were a venomous snake. The fortress she had built around herself, a fortress of bylaws and intimidation, had been breached and was now collapsing in on her. The legal battle to come would be a formality. The war had already been won. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the community and, more importantly, through the personal lives of Karen, Brenda, and Gerald. The interim HOA board, guided by a new competent lawyer, immediately moved to distance the association from the former board members. Their first legal filing was a cross-complaint against Karen, Brenda, and Gerald, arguing that if the HOA was found liable, it was solely due to the former board members acting outside the scope of their authority and against the advice of experts like George the Surveyor. This brilliant legal maneuver effectively threw the former board members under the bus, leaving them personally exposed. Brenda and Gerald, faced with the prospect of financial ruin, quickly folded. Their lawyers negotiated a settlement. They each wrote formal public letters of apology to me and the other families they had harassed. They agreed to pay a portion of the damages from their own pockets, a painful but manageable sum, and in exchange, we would drop them from the lawsuit. They were terrified, and their testimony against Karen would be invaluable. Karen, however, refused to go down without a fight. Fueled by a toxic cocktail of narcissism and denial, she hired her own lawyer, a cut-rate solo practitioner who specialized in traffic tickets and DUIs. She countersued me for harassment, and causing emotional distress. It was a laughable, desperate move that only dug her hole deeper. The legal process dragged on for months, a slow grind of depositions and discovery. It was during Karen's deposition that her entire defense imploded. David, in his calm, methodical way, walked her through the evidence. He put the county plat map in front of her. "Mrs. Covington, is this the official plat map for Maple Creek Estates?" "I suppose so," she sniffed. "And does this map show the tract of land in question as part of Mr. Morgan's deeded property?" Her lawyer tried to object, but the judge overruled him. "It appears to," she conceded, her voice barely a whisper. "And are you aware," David continued, pressing his advantage, "that your own HOA's governing documents state that your authority is limited to the common areas as defined by this very map?" She remained silent. "And yet you authorized the destruction of Mr. Morgan's property on land you knew, or should have known, was not under your control. Is that correct?" She tried to bluster, to talk about the spirit of the covenants and the character of the community, but David cut her off. "Yes or no, Mrs. Covington? Did you authorize the concrete pour?" "Yes, but—" "Thank you," David said, cutting her off. He then produced the sworn affidavit from George the surveyor, detailing the meeting from 5 years prior, where he explicitly told her she had no jurisdiction over the easement. "Mrs. Covington, do you recall this meeting where a professional surveyor informed you that you were mistaken about the status of this land?" Her face went white. She had been caught in a direct, provable lie. She claimed she didn't recall the specifics of the conversation. It was a weak, transparent evasion that completely destroyed her credibility. The deposition was a disaster for her. She came across as a liar, a bully, and someone who was fundamentally incompetent. Her own lawyer looked defeated. The final nail in her coffin was the quiet title action. It was a separate, faster legal process. The judge reviewed the survey, the deed, and the plat map. The case was so straightforward it barely took 15 minutes. The judge granted my motion for summary judgment, issuing a formal court order that the property was mine, the easement was for utility access only, and the HOA had no authority over it whatsoever. This legally recorded judgment made the concrete pour an undisputed act of criminal trespass and destruction of property. With the judge's order in hand, Karen's case was unwinnable. Her lawyer, seeing the writing on the wall and likely tired of not getting paid, advised her to settle immediately. She had no choice. The final settlement was brutal. The HOA's insurance, after much fighting, agreed to pay a portion of the damages related to the initial property destruction, but they refused to cover any of the punitive damages or the claims related to the fraudulent lien, citing the willful misconduct clause. That meant the rest of the bill fell to the HOA and to Karen personally. The new HOA board, to its credit, did the right thing. They agreed to a settlement that included paying for the full cost of the concrete removal and gate replacement, covering all my legal fees, and rescinding every fine Karen had ever issued to residents like Mrs. Gable and the Rodriguez family, refunding any money they had paid. The lien on Mrs. Gable's house was removed, but the punitive damages, the part of the settlement designed to punish the wrongdoing, were assigned directly to Karen. The final amount she was personally liable for was just over $150,000. It was a sum calculated to be devastating but not completely impossible to pay, ensuring she would feel the consequences for years to come. It was a life-altering amount of money for a woman living on a modest retirement income. The news of the settlement spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The sense of relief was immense. It was more than just a victory for me. It was a victory for the entire community. It was a clear message that the abuse of power would not be tolerated. The final act of this drama played out not in a courtroom, but right back where it all started, on my property line. The settlement money came through, and the first thing I did was hire a heavy construction crew to deal with the concrete monstrosity. They brought in a massive excavator with a hydraulic hammer attachment. The sound of that hammer, a percussive, rhythmic booming, echoed through the neighborhood for an entire day. It was the sound of justice being served, of a wrong being made right. Each crack that appeared in the gray slab felt like a small victory. They broke it into manageable chunks and hauled it away, leaving behind nothing but scarred earth. I hired a landscaper to restore the ground, and then I began work on a new gate. This one was even better than the first, made of heavier gauge steel with a more intricate design. It was a statement. It said, "This is my land and I will defend it." As I was finishing the installation, a moving truck pulled up in front of Karen's house down the street. The settlement had forced her to sell. She couldn't afford the payments and the mortgage. The house she had lorded over the neighborhood from was being emptied out, its contents packed into cardboard boxes. I watched for a moment as she directed the movers, her face a mask of bitter resentment. There was no sign of the arrogant, all-powerful HOA president. She just looked like a defeated, angry woman who had lost everything because she couldn't stand to see a gate she didn't control. Later that afternoon, Sarah and I hosted a small barbecue in our backyard for all the neighbors who had supported us. Mrs. Gable was there, her garden gnomes now proudly displayed back in her front yard. Leo Rodriguez was shooting hoops in my driveway with his dad, using a brand new permanent basketball hoop I'd helped them install. We had taken on a bully and won. We had. We had taken on a bully and won. We had restored not just our own rights, but a sense of fairness and community to the neighborhood. The new HOA board was working. They had rewritten some of the vaguest and most abused bylaws, creating clear, objective standards. They held open, transparent meetings. The era of harassment was over. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, I looked over at my new gate, gleaming in the golden light. It was more than just steel and hinges. It was a symbol of resilience, a monument to the simple, powerful idea that you have a right to peace and quiet on your own land. A few weeks later, I received a simple, handwritten card in the mail. It was from Mrs. Gable. Inside, it just said, "Thank you for giving us our neighborhood back." And for the gnomes, it was, in its own way, more satisfying than the settlement check. Justice isn't always about the money. Sometimes it's about the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, of order restored, and of knowing that a community is a little bit safer, a little bit fairer, because you refuse to back down. Karen Covington had tried to entomb my rights in concrete, but in the end, the only thing she buried was herself.